Hot topic today, DNA. I'm your host, Kate Wilson, and we are talking about the announcement that 23andMe filed for bankruptcy. In case you aren't familiar, 23andMe is a direct to consumer genetic testing lab, meaning that no doctor has to order the test. You can spit into a kit that you get online or at a retail store, pay the fee, and get results back related to a variety of things. Reports can include genetic health information such as risk for hereditary conditions in you or potentially your children. Results are also available in ancestry info as well as traits and wellness information. Traits and wellness may tell you things like if you're prone to cilantro aversion or how well you process caffeine. About 15 million people have taken a 23andMe test. Currently, 23andMe has indicated plans to continue operations while it seeks bids to acquire all or parts of the business. On today's episode, we are talking to Anya Prince, she, her, who is a professor of law at the University of Iowa College of Law. Her teaching and research interests explore health and genetic privacy, with a particular focus on genetic discrimination, the health privacy implications of big data, and the ethical, legal, and social implications of genomic testing. Let's get started. Thank you so much for being on the show today, Anya.
My pleasure.
I actually had wanted to interview you for a bit. You were on my list of names to get to as I've been working through the podcast. And I was thinking we would do a more general discussion about genetic data privacy and talking about how information is used, stored, and protected. But given the recent news with 23andMe and them filing for bankruptcy, I thought we could discuss this case more specifically and then maybe get into some more general discussion. And for those listeners that aren't aware, can you give us a brief overview of what's happening with 23andMe?
Yeah, great. So 23andMe is one of the largest, if not the largest, direct-to-consumer genetic testing company. They have 15 million consumers' genetic information, customers' genetic information, and they have been having financial trouble over the past few years for various reasons. And there's been questions about whether or not they were going to file for bankruptcy. And indeed, just about a week ago, over the weekend, they announced that they were going to file for bankruptcy. And so there's questions now of what will happen to all that customer data and really the business model of direct to consumer testing in general.
And they were one of the, I guess, pioneers or leaders in the direct to consumer testing industry. And I guess that's really my next question is what's going to happen to that genetic data? Do we know, or are there a few different things potentially that could happen?
So there's lots of things that could happen. I mean, I think the most important thing to realize is that it is within 23andMe's right to sell the customer data within a bankruptcy proceeding. And so in their privacy policy, it specifically says that they will, that they have, in the case of a sale or bankruptcy or merger or anything like that, that the customer data can go with a new company. We don't know, I think, who might be the purchaser. There's talk that the CEO stepped down so that she could potentially rebid. She's been trying to bid to take it private again. So maybe it would go to her in a more private capacity, but there could be other companies that are interested as well.
At this point, since we're not sure what's going to happen to that data, what should customers be concerned about at this point? So those that have already done the 23andMe testing, what should they be concerned about with their genetic data?
So I think the biggest thing, so let me take a step back, and one thing I like to start with is reminding people that our health privacy law in this country, HIPAA, does not apply in this situation.
Okay.
Right. So HIPAA protects health information within the healthcare setting, but not within outside of the healthcare setting. And so even though 23andMe has health data, they can use it pretty much at the federal level any way they want, right? The only thing constraining them is the privacy policy at the federal level, right? They have to abide by what they say in the privacy policy.
In their own privacy policy.
In their own privacy policy.
Right. Okay.
And their privacy policy, like I said, says that they can sell the data. And so what should people be worried about? Well, a new company can also, right, has at the federal level no restrictions in terms of whether they can sell the data, who they can sell the data to, how they could use it. And so while 23andMe is predominantly using it for research, maybe for a sale to a pharmaceutical company, they've put some guardrails on how they use the data, like they won't give the data to law enforcement unless they have a warrant or a subpoena. Well, a new company isn't restricted in that way. They could change the privacy policy to say, we're going to allow law enforcement widespread access to this data. They could say, well, we're going to sell this data to advertisers. We're going to sell this data to pharmaceutical companies, right? Right now, when 23andMe shares it, they generally share it de-identified, right? They remove somebody's name. A new company could say, well, we're going to share more identifiable information. And again, at the federal level, there's no law stopping them from doing that as long as they give customers notice in a privacy policy that says, here's that, right? We all know we've gotten that. Our privacy policy has been updated, and we delete that email or ignore it because we get 20 of those a day. But that's essentially the process. And so that's the worry, is that a new company could change the way that they use the data, or use the data themselves in a way that customers don't like.
Understood. And I was going to include a link to the privacy policy from 23andMe in the show notes. And it sounds like that's the concern is, I mean, we don't know what we don't know. So if somebody else, some other company buys it, then they can do certain things with that data that maybe was not intended by the customers originally because they were comfortable with the 23andMe privacy policy.
Yeah, when we share our health information, our general information, our genetic information out there outside the healthcare space, we really are giving up our rights to control what happens to the data because there's no general federal data privacy law that constrains that, really.
Okay. And I know you had mentioned HIPAA, and that applies like in a health setting. What about things like GINA, the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act? Does that apply in this case?
Yeah, so the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act is a federal law that prohibits health insurers and employers from discriminating on the basis of genetic information. So that would still stand. And that law also prohibits those entities, the health insurers and the employers, from collecting genetic information. And so GINA would prohibit the health insurers from like buying genetic information of their customers, or employers from trying to gain access to that. But GINA doesn't say anything about direct-to-consumer genetic testing companies. It only covers that limited sphere of use. So it is protective in some way, but there's so many gaps then about other entities. Oftentimes people think about life insurance or long-term care or disability insurance. Those aren't covered by GINA. And so there's a lot of other companies out there, or actors out there in the world that are allowed to use genetic information in ways that people would find discriminatory. And again, that wouldn't violate federal law.
One question I had is what makes genetic data different from other data that can identify you? So, there's like federal databases with fingerprints, there's facial recognition, right? And so there's these large data sets or databases that can be used potentially to identify individuals. How is that different than what we're seeing with genetic data?
So I think there's a debate about this. I think there would be some people who would answer your question and say, there's nothing different about genetic information. It's genetic exceptionalism to focus so much on this one piece. And so, in a lot of ways, all sorts of data can tell us can predict how we might behave in the future, can predict disease risk, can predict lots of things that we might worry about with genetic information. That said, I think it's shown over and over that people really do feel differently about their genetic information and the privacy of their genetic information. And whether that's something more like existential, like the DNA, is like who I am, and it's more identity based. It could be that, right? So it just feels weird to have your DNA out there in a way that you can't control. And then it does potentially I mean, I think two things that are features of genetic information is that it can predict disease risk, and so that can be very sensitive information or private information, and it's so intertwined with family, right? Once you have somebody's genetic information in, then it implicates all sorts of family members. Now, there could be other data that also does that, but I think genetic information is very clearly can predict disease and implicate family members in ways that others do to a lesser extent.
Right. And it's surprising to me when I talk to folks who have done some of these DTC direct to consumer tests that don't necessarily realize that by submitting their DNA, they have submitted essentially half their kids' DNA, their biological children's DNA. And so that's something that I think is always at the forefront of people's minds. The other thing I'm thinking about is genetic data really ever de-identified? So full disclosure, I actually worked on some of the Ancestry Health back when I worked for a lab that was performing some of that testing and went down a huge rabbit hole in terms of privacy laws. What does de-identified or anonymous truly mean? So for anyone that's submitting, a blood or a saliva sample, is their data, genetic data, ever truly anonymous and de-identified?
I mean, the short answer is no, right? Because our genetic sequence is unique, unless we're have an identical twin, right? And so it is just a fascinating part about the law that the law, and this is true in the research context, this is true in the HIPAA context, this is true, in the context we're talking about now. But in all of those contexts, we look at de-identified, in air quotes, without your name on it. We look at that differently than we look at something that has your name or your social security or your address on it. And there's a lot of debate out there about whether that paradigm between de-identified and identified really makes sense anymore,
Mhm.
especially with big data, right? I mean, this is true not just of genetic information, just but data overall. It doesn't take too many data points about a person to be able to identify them. And this could be age, zip code, and gender, right? But you could think of all sorts of, likes country music and does this, and you can start to really narrow down people with enough data points. But genetic information, of course, you just match up the sequence. Now, I think the question there then is, what is the risk?
Mm.
The risk to somebody is a lot lower because re-identifying does take effort. And so when 23andMe shares de-identified genetic sequences with a pharmaceutical company as part of their business model, which they've done before,
Right.
what really are the risks that somebody within the pharmaceutical company is going to re-identify somebody? And some of the studies that have showed that they can re-identify people, one of the easiest ways to do that is if you already have a segment of the DNA, so you can match that up, right? A segment of the DNA that is identified. And so then if somebody already has a segment of your DNA that is identified, they probably already have access. So I think it is a very, I, I think that in some ways it's silly to say that we can de-identify things. I think in another sense, it has some practical value just because it does minimize the risk, because it would then take an extra step for somebody to want to re-identify it for whatever reason to then use it in some sort of way that we might be concerned about.
Right. And that's what I was thinking is getting into almost a more philosophical debate about like de identified data. If you were to take that and try to re identify it or figure out where it came from, it is a fairly involved process. And we've had labs that are not direct consumer labs, right? That do DNA testing all the time. And part of what they have to do is have protections in place for that data. Is it different because it's direct to consumer and not a diagnostic lab? As you said, like HIPAA wouldn't apply. Are there other things that don't apply because it's direct to consumer and it's not through a physician ordered test?
Yeah, so for example, the CLIA, the Clinical Laboratory Improvements Act, that regulates testing of clinical labs, wouldn't apply here either because they're not a clinical lab, and so there's other sort of guardrails in terms of just how something's processed, what steps it goes through that wouldn't apply to the direct to consumer scenario.
And one of the other things I know with the 23andMe is that the type of testing is what's typically called like SNP testing or single nucleotide polymorphism. So they're sort of looking at more shorter pieces of DNA instead of reading, the full book, all the pages, all the chapters, all the words, all the letters. They're only looking at maybe a chapter or a paragraph, and not the full thing. Does that matter in terms of protection for customers that it's not the full sequencing?
I'm not sure that it does, in the sense of they would have the ability, if they wanted, to do the full sequence, right? I mean,
Mm.
they have. Well, I should say I don't know how what 23andMe does in terms of storing the biospecimen in the future. I know that you can request a deletion of the biospecimen, but I don't know for how long.
And I think that's a good distinguish is that there's the data that they've already tested and have in storage, but then they also have the specimen itself because some people can opt in for them to keep their specimen.
I don't know about the opt-in for keeping it, but I think, yeah, we can distinguish between biospecimen and data, and to the extent that they still have the biospecimen, they could always sequence it and do the full sequence. And then it's also a question of how they get the SNPs, right? When they sequence it, do they have a full sequence somewhere and then they only have the computer read out the SNPs, but there's the data in the background that theoretically they could get? When they share it for research, do they only share the SNPs, or do they share a full sequence? So I don't know enough about the inner workings of 23andMe to know that, but
Hmm.
I think these are the types of questions about usage that are important for people to consider.
Yeah, and I think it's, again, as folks, you and I that work in this space, we're like, yeah, we don't necessarily know how some of that's being parsed out. So I would say customers that it's also challenging to kind of figure out how some of the data is obtained, how it's stored, and then how it's transferred to third parties. If somebody were to go in and delete their data from 23andMe, can it be totally deleted? Because as we're talking about, it's not necessarily clear cut. It's not like flipping an on off switch.
Yeah. So in the privacy policy, the 23andMe says you have the right to request a deletion of your account. And so again, we got to think about all of the different parts. So there's the DNA, there's the biospecimen, there's the sequencer, and the DNA, and then there's actually a lot of other information about you, including like all the health surveys somebody might have taken, or the surveys somebody might have taken if they opted into research. And there's also the research opt-in. About 80% of customers opted into research. So you can opt out of research. That would stop your data from being shared for research. You can request a deletion of the account, which would close that. In the privacy policy, it does say that they retain some genetic information for legal purposes. And so I should go back. I mentioned that CLIA might not apply. They actually say that one of the reasons they keep genetic information is for things like auditing from like CLIA, right? That you need to keep it for so many years,
Right.
just to make sure. There is some debate, I think, and I've seen some legal scholars debate whether or not actually like CLIA would apply to them, but that is something that they say that they're keeping that for some of those laws. But they keep, I think, a minimal amount, and it should for just a time limited amount, and then delete it after that purpose.
How would somebody, if they want to delete their information, do they just log on to their account? And is that the best way for them to delete it? Is checking all the
Do the
boxes, I guess?
Yeah. So for somebody who's interested, there's been a number of guides, but one I've seen that's quite comprehensive is the California Attorney General put out warning to customers to say that they suggested deleting, and they walked through step by step, like, here's the buttons to click. So even if you don't live in California, the buttons would presumably be the same. And so that's an example guide. One thing that I think it's important for customers to know, or just people to know, individuals to know, is that you can download the data. And so if somebody's going to request a deletion of their account, you could download all the data first so that you have it for the future, and you don't lose access to that information that somehow might be relevant or helpful in the future. And then yeah, you could log on and request deletion. I will say that I have heard news reports that because so many people have been logging on and trying to delete their data, that there's been backlogs and difficulty getting like the verification codes that you need to get into your account. And so I'd imagine that over time there'll be fewer people, right? I mean, I think this is
Hmm.
going to be an onslaught in this week of
Right.
people requesting their accounts to be deleted. So somebody who's really interested, I would say, keep keep trying, because it is illegal. Well, it's a legal right in some states to delete the data. It's a legal right in some countries to delete the data, and then it's a legal right under 23andMe's current privacy policy to delete the data.
Okay. So just at this time, there might be so much traffic that just keep trying because it just may be overwhelming the servers at this point.
Yeah, or wait 2 weeks, right,
Yeah.
and then try again.
Yeah. And I've talked to some folks that don't have concerns. They're like, it's fine. I already had opted in. I'm okay with them continuing to share, or, something else happens with my data. And it is a very large database. As you mentioned, like 15 million folks have done it. And I know that a lot of researchers have utilized that data. So there have been some very helpful things that have come out of that. Some of the customers have decided, oh, I'm comfortable leaving it. I'm not going to delete the data. Is there any way for them moving forward to protect their data, or things they should be thinking about if they're not going to delete their data?
So I'd say a couple things. One, I think different people have different appetites for risk, for uncertainty, for comfort level of sharing their genetic data. And so it makes total sense to me that some people would say, I'm fine with this. And some people would say, no, I'm really uncomfortable. I think the biggest problem in this space is when there's a disconnect between how people think their data is protected and how it actually is protected. And so if somebody fully understands the second part of my
Hmm.
response that I'll get to, right, then I think it's fine to have your data out there. But to your question of can you do anything to protect your data, the answer is basically no, because the 23andMe privacy policy says in the event of bankruptcy, we can sell your data. The new company has to abide by our current privacy policy. Sounds great. But the current privacy policy says we can change this privacy policy from time to time and notify you. And
Hmm.
so if they change the privacy policy in a way that you all of a sudden don't agree with, then what can you do? Maybe not anything. Like I said, in some states, there's about 11 states or a few more have passed laws that say that direct to consumer companies you have to be able to delete your data, but those state laws are targeted towards direct to consumer companies. So what if a company that's not going to be a direct to consumer testing company purchases this data? You might not have the ability to anymore delete your data from this account. One commenter that I heard talking about this was talking about how the next version of this might not have a service back to you, and so it's not like you'll continue to get updates on Ancestry. Maybe,
Right.
right? Maybe that's a service, but we don't know. And so because of our legal system and our lack of broad data privacy in this country, there is really very little that people can do to control their data going forward. And if they're fine with that, and they're fine with it just being out there and used in in really a lot of possible ways, then fine, leave that in there, because you could imagine and hope that a pharmaceutical company would purchase this, or some medical research group, and some like good would come out of it. But the very fact of the matter is we don't know, we can't
Hmm.
control it, and customers have very little recourse, because once you give away the data, there's really little you can do.
Right. It's the cat's out of the bag, and it's sort of hard to kind of get some of that back in, or to say like, here's what I want my data to be used for.
Mhm. And can I also say, with the research piece, I think there's also other research that's going on, right? 23andMe is not the only way to have your genetic information being used for really important research. Of course, in the US right now, NIH is losing funding. And so some
Mhm.
of the other things that I would say, like that would be ways that we would want to increase research, are under threat right now. But it's not that there are other programs going on and other ways to participate in research. And so I don't think it's the end all be all. And there's not a guarantee that the next buyer will use this for research either. I mean, that's one of the most obvious assets, like way to leverage that asset to make money, but we don't know.
Right. And you had mentioned that Anne has stepped down, so like the founder of 23andMe, because she may be interested in purchasing it or taking it private. Has there been any indication of what she or this new potential private company, private venture would be?
I haven't heard anything specific. I mean,
I haven't either. So that's why I was like, well, I've got you. Let me ask, just if you've
yeah,
seen anything.
I haven't. I mean, it's so interesting because it was private.
Mm-hmm.
They took it public, and then now they're trying to take it private again.
Mm-hmm.
The company, right? So it wouldn't be sold on the stock market. There wouldn't be shareholders. And so, does that just mean that she wants to take it private again so that it's easier to make decisions? I think it's hard to know.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
what that business model would look like and whether there's other ways. But even if it's private, the biggest asset that 23andMe has is the data. And so in order to make this profitable, you basically have to leverage the data somehow,
Right.
whether that's selling it to pharmaceutical companies, finding some medical breakthrough. And that hasn't worked so far, right? It hasn't been enough to keep the company afloat, but that's sort of the way out of this, is having somebody figure out how to leverage that data.
Right. And I think that's been a challenge from a few companies that have done direct to consumer or like physician initiated testing, but still it's driven kind of by the consumer wanting that test. Is you can get all this data, but then how does that then translate into potential earnings, right, for the company? And when Ancestry was bought out, I don't know if there's any lessons we can learn from that, or I believe MyHeritage was another one. They both were purchased by other companies. Did anything happen in those cases in terms of the data, or I think they kind of just operated business as usual?
Yeah, I don't know of any specifics there. The one example that I know in terms of the privacy risks that we've seen, which is a little different, but GED Match
Mm,
is a website where people they don't do genetic testing themselves, but people can take their raw genetic sequence and upload it onto GED Match and then find relatives through that. And so that company has a lot of genetic information. It's just that they didn't, do the tests themselves. And they came in the news because people learned that they were sharing their customers' genetic information with law enforcement broadly. There was controversy. GED Match changed their privacy policy to say we will only share with a warrant or subpoena. And then they were sold, and they were sold to a new company, and that new company is very closely tied to law enforcement. Like that, their sort of business model is working with law enforcement. And so the new company changed the privacy policy to say we would work with law enforcement and share genetic data with law enforcement. And the only way that the individuals could access their account to get their genetic data and all their family members and everything that was in there was to agree to this new privacy policy from the new company. And so that's an example of the case where the ethos of GED Match changed, right? The privacy ethos of the company changed because of consumer pushback. And then lo and behold, a new company came in and reverted right back to what people saw as problematic before, and really put customers in a bind to make the choice between accessing their data or agreeing to this privacy policy. And it's a little unclear whether customers knew that that was the bind they were in, right? They probably just clicked yes without reading the changes and didn't realize how much that they were now agreeing to something that they might not be comfortable with this new company.
Do you have any advice for customers, for the general public, whether they've done testing or taken their testing from somewhere else and upload it to a place like GED Match? Things that they should look out for. I mean, clearly, I think that one of the takeaways is if you get an email that says they've updated their privacy policy, read through it. But is there other things people could do to keep up to date or to be aware of potential changes to their data privacy?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things is to have everybody reflect on what level of sharing they're comfortable with. I think that's one of the first steps. Like, what are some of the possible uses? Do you care about your genetic information being shared just in general, where you might not know how it's shared? Do you care whether it's shared with law enforcement? Do you care whether it's shared with researchers? Do you care whether it's shared with for-profit researchers versus nonprofit researchers? And that helps then, when you do look at the privacy policies, to target it, to say, okay, which are the changes that then don't match up with my values and how I want my genetic information to be treated. Because again, that's that disconnect that I worry about. And so I think that reflection of saying, okay, well, what am I nervous about? I've been hearing about all this in the news. Like, what is it that I personally am worried about? And so, for example, I personally am an extremely private person and generally don't want my data shared in ways that I can't control. And so I'm not in 23andMe for that reason, right? Because I didn't
Mm-hmm.
opt to give the information in the first instance. But if I had, I would be much more likely to want to delete it or pay really close attention to the bankruptcy proceedings and who might be a buyer, and seeing if that matches up with my values, than somebody on sort of the other end of this privacy spectrum that says, I'd post my whole genetic sequence online and I wouldn't care.
Right. So it definitely is a comfort level, and I think you frame it in a good way with thinking about your values and saying, what am I most concerned about? What am I most worried about? And is the language I'm getting leaving this open to something that potentially would be maybe not my worst fear, but a fear?
Mhm.
One question too I wanted to ask, and this kind of gets out of the privacy or the regulations, but we have people that are bad actors, right? There's only so much you can protect the data because there's hackers, right? And so there was a breach not too long ago, I believe, with 23andMe, right, where they were
Mhm.
able to access millions potentially of people's data. How much of a concern is that for people? Like, they found a company, they like the company, their values are in line with that privacy statement. Is there anything that can be done or that companies are doing to try to minimize this type of access, illegal access to genetic data?
Yeah, so I would say overall, health data is the most targeted data by hackers. This is true of our health data within healthcare settings, and this is true of our health data outside healthcare settings, because it is lucrative and to know information about people's health, including their genetic information. Also, really problematically and worrisome, there's some evidence that those hackers were particularly targeting and posting people with Ashkenazi Jewish ancestries, and I believe Chinese ancestries, if I'm remembering correctly, but really targeting specific groups to post data. And it's not like, you think about data breaches that you hear about in other contexts where your social security number or your bank account information might have gotten out. And there we have steps we can take, right? They don't always feel like completely making you whole, right? But we can freeze our credit. We can, monitor accounts being taken out in our name. And you can, if you really need, change your bank account number, change your credit card number, but you can't change your DNA if somebody leaks it, right? So it really is a difficult situation when there's a leak. I mean, I think companies have an interest in not having their information hacked, right? So there are security things. I mentioned these state laws that regulate direct to consumer testing companies. Some of those state laws do have some security standards that have to be followed, but security, HIPAA, the privacy law, also is a security law. And so within the
Mm.
healthcare setting, there are way more standards on how health information has to be secured than there are from these companies. And so again, you might I think this is a really important point. A new company might purchase this data and might have really great privacy ethos, but be not have a security, like, not have a good database security, cybersecurity practices. And so the strength of protection of your data is only strong as the company that purchases it, and that's also really hard for customers to assess, because I'm not a
Yeah.
computer scientist. I don't know what, encryption needs to happen in order for my data to be secured. So again, it's just one more layer of trusting a company to do the best thing with our data, and they don't have necessarily as many good guardrails also protecting that.
Well, and I think a lot of companies and testing labs can have excellent guardrails, but there's always going to be somebody trying to find that chink in the armor, as it were.
Mhm. One thing I just like to mention is that we've talked quite a bit about the laws that protect, right, the privacy laws, but also the anti-discrimination laws like GINA. And it's really important to keep in mind that these are all dependent on where you live. So there's different state law protections, there's federal law protections, but also these 15 million customers aren't just from the US, they're from all over the world. So to the extent there's anybody not from the US or have family members who've done this that don't live in the US, other jurisdictions might have different protections. So for example, the European Union has a much, much stronger data protection law called the GDPR, that the acronym is, I'm blanking on the acronym, but the GDPR. And so how a new company could use Europeans' genetic information within 23andMe might be very different than how a new company could use an American's data. So it's just important to know that the laws are really, even though our families move all across the world and we share genetic information, the laws don't necessarily follow.
And that's an excellent point, because each state, each country, they all have different types of regulations and protections. So it's important, if it's something that someone's concerned about, to research where they live and what the protections are for the geography, the region where they're at. So I appreciate you being here and sharing your insights and your expertise. It was a very fascinating conversation, but also trying to think about what's going to happen. I think we're going to learn a lot in the next few weeks, and I think it's going to have some very large repercussions just in general with the healthcare testing system.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for the conversation. I really enjoyed it.
For more information about this episode, visit allaccessdna.podbean.com, where you can also stream all episodes of the show. This link is also in the show notes for easy access. Any inquiries on the podcast can be sent to allaccessdna@gmail.com. Check out our Patreon at patreon.com/allaccessdna and consider donating to get bonus content, submit questions for our guests, and connect with other genetic curious individuals. Note that this podcast is for entertainment and education and is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice. Please consult your physician with any questions you may have regarding your health. Please rate and review the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. This helps other people like you discover the show. All Access DNA is hosted, produced, and edited by Kate Wilson. The logo design is by Designs by NKJ. Thanks for listening, and join us next time.